When the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie came out back in 2014, it pretty much shocked everyone, having a cast made up of the most D-list superheroes you could think of, featuring a soundtrack of songs from the 70s and 80s, and being a sci-fi comedy, and somehow it all worked together beautifully. It was lightning in a bottle. Then James Gunn was able to make lightning strike twice with Volume 2, with it being, in my humble opinion, better than the first, having better action, more jokes, a lot more emotion than the first one, and overall just being way more fun. However, with the strained relationship he was starting to have with Marvel after being fired and then rehired by them, and his new ventures with DC, made me extremely worried for Volume 3. Would Gunn phone it in with this film to go back to play with his new universe? Or would he try to still stick the landing with this last film? And could he even stick the landing with how much had happened between those movies and Endgame? Well, my god, he did it. He damn well did it. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was a terrific film, and perhaps might be the best of the trilogy, though I think it'll be a while till I fully determine that, really. But compared to the first two films, this one goes for a much darker tone. There is still the signature humor and banter between everyone here, but for the most part, this film isn't trying to be as happy and upbeat as the previous ones. It tackles some pretty dark subject matter here, like animal testing, animal cruelty, and even genocide a little bit, with some pretty horrifying imagery to go along with it. In addition to those tones and such, the film is extremely emotional. The story is based around the characters themselves and what they've gone through to get to this point, rather than something else pulling them into the story. I really enjoyed the fact that the film wasn't trying to top the previous ones in threat level size. The first one had them saving a whole planet, then trying to save the whole galaxy, and I didn't really need to see them try to take down some even bigger threat. The fact that the story is pretty much solely focusing on the characters this time around, rather than something else that's threatening the whole universe, really elevated the stakes here. The movie knows that it doesn't need a massive threat to get us hooked in, since anything threatening the characters we've followed along with for the last 9 years is already enough to get us hooked. And as for the characters, they're all written terrifically here. This is pretty much the perfect swan song for all these guys. Peter Quill, while sidelined to an extent here, is great, still getting over the death of Gamora and dealing with the alternate timeline version of her that's still present, trying to find that romance they had with each other. I really like how the film tackled the relationship between them, or lack thereof. Gunn was written into a corner when Gamora was killed in Infinity War. That was never what he had planned for the character, and I do find it a little sad that we won't ever see what the original vision was for her, but the fact that the film made this work and doesn't end with them getting together and just going their separate ways was a perfect way to finish off that storyline. Drax and Mantis continue to be entertaining here, and both have satisfying conclusions to their character, and both end up in places that I think were perfect for both of them individually. The character that I wasn't expecting, though, to be as good as they were was Nebula. Going back and seeing where she started out in the beginning to her story to where she is now is kind of incredible. Seeing her slowly warm up to everyone and becoming more open to them as well is great. I'd even go as far as to say that out of all the characters in the MCU, she probably has the most consistent and greatest amount of growth compared to practically any other. I really enjoyed seeing her on screen. She was great. But Rocket was undoubtedly the main focus of this film, and was kind of the main character here in a way. Seeing his heartbreaking backstory to how he's been dealing with the grief he's been living with really pulls at your heartstrings. The movie really makes Rocket into a more sympathetic and understanding character than he was in the previous two Guardians films. And hell, a lot of the moments in those previous films hit a lot harder now, especially since we know the context to what happened to him. It's just so depressing and sad. But again, like everyone else, I love the ending that he has. The High Evolutionary as well was a great villain. He perfectly switches between cold and calculating and loud and over the top constantly throughout the film. And what we see this guy do in the film really gets you to hate him. A lot. Some people might bring up the fact that he wasn't all that deep and interesting, but personally I thought of him having a god complex and being so viciously cruel to accomplish his goals of creating the perfect society and being all pristine and nice was all the motivation he really needed. Not all villains need to be as deep as Thanos with multiple layers as to why they do the messed up things that they do. I mean, sometimes they can just be evil for the hell of it, but those villains need to be entertaining to make up for that lack of depth. I think the High Evolutionary accomplished that perfectly. And even then, there's a great line in the film where he said something akin to, "There is no God, that's why I stepped in to do this." and I thought that perfectly summed up his character and what he's about. On the technical side of the film, Volume 3 looks extremely good, especially compared to the last MCU project. A ton of practical effects were used in tandem with CGI, which makes everything here look and feel way more real. There were a handful of scenes that I was honestly shocked to see were using practical effects and how insanely good they look. It really goes to show how well a film can look when it uses its budget properly, when not everything needs to be CGI and people aren't being worked to the bone. But the other things in the film, like the action, was great. The side characters were extremely entertaining. The music was as good as ever. The jokes were still pretty funny, and everything else was good. There's really nothing else I can say about this film that no one else has brought up. But really, the only issues that I have with the film here are extremely minor ones. Like, they didn't affect my overall enjoyment of the film, or were really that bad, but they're still worth bringing up, since they're issues nonetheless. Firstly, and most notably, Adam Warlock's role in the film. Adam had been teased in Guardians Volume 2, and it seemed as though he was going to be a powerful threat. But unfortunately, I think he was fairly underutilized in the film. Like, he gets the main plot going, but really doesn't do all that much besides that, and saving Quill in the finale. He's more of a minor inconvenience for the characters, rather than a serious threat. It felt as though Gunn had almost forgotten about him and couldn't find a more natural way to write him into the story. At the very least, I enjoyed his performance and he was overall entertaining. I didn't think he was bad or anything, it was just underwritten and a little out of place here. The music this time around, while having good songs, didn't feel like they fit entirely as well as the previous films. Like, there was never really a definitive moment for me where the music helped enhance the film, like Come and Get Your Love in the first, or Come a Little Bit Closer in Volume 2. I'm actually pretty sure there was a song that lasted for 10 seconds before being abruptly cut. Though I will at least admit there was one moment where there was a song being played that really did make the movie feel awesome in a specific action scene, and I think you guys know which scene I'm talking about. The pacing additionally felt off. This is a 2-hour and 30-minute movie, and while I think a majority of that was used effectively in helping flesh out the characters and such, it did seem as though some stuff here could have been trimmed a little bit. Like the heist section, where it kinda went on just a little bit longer than it needed to, and that's more apparent when it comes out that the mission didn't really mean that much since the information the Guardians were after in that scene is now in an entirely different place. And that extra time from the heist could have been devoted to some other things, like the High Evolutionary and how he's dealt with in the finale, who kinda just gets the crap beaten out of him fairly easily, even after the film showed how he had these gravity-changing abilities he could even overpower Adam Warlock with. So I wish the film touched on that a little more. Finally, the weird cutting off of serious moments with jokes is still present here in Gunn's writing. Though, like I mentioned earlier, there is significantly less comedy here than in his previous films, so that allows way more serious moments to be fully realized. And it's certainly not as bad as it was in Volume 2, but with this being a much more dark film, it leads to those moments feeling way more out of place than they usually would. I mean, luckily the jokes themselves are still pretty funny, but I wish this issue didn't keep coming back up. But besides those things, it's really hard to come up with any major issues that take away from the film as a whole. The movie was just that solid. It built upon the themes and ideas of the previous films while also expanding the characters with arcs that naturally led to each of them getting satisfying conclusions. It had a terrific villain that you wanted to hate, action that was intense and gripping, visuals that continue to be creative and beautiful to look at. The fact that this movie stuck the landing and left me with a feeling of satisfaction and completion this much speaks volumes to how well it was written. Now, it is unfortunate that this is kind of the last MCU project that I was legitimately excited for, and I could really care less about what's to come, but at the same time, I don't really have to care about the MCU anymore. But anyways, of course, with the high amounts of praise I gave this film, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 gets nothing less than a 9 out of 10.